3rd, 1957. 5:32 in the morning, Moscow time. A rocket designated R7, serial number 8K71PS, lifts off from Baikonur Cosmodrome in the Kazakh steppe. The sound is beyond description, a roar that flattens the scrub grass for a quarter mile and sends flocks of birds scattering across a sky that hasn't seen the sun yet. Inside the payload, a pressurized capsule no bigger than a washing machine, a dog is strapped into a padded harness. Her heart rate, captured by sensors glued to her chest, reads 240 beats per minute, 3 times her resting pulse. She's terrified, and she's about to become the first living creature to orbit the Earth. Her name is Laika. It means barker in Russian, though the scientists who named her said she rarely made a sound. A quiet dog with a calm disposition, pulled from the streets of Moscow because the Soviet space program had discovered something counterintuitive. Stray dogs made better cosmonauts than purebreds. They'd already survived the worst: cold, hunger, traffic, the indifference of an entire city. What was a rocket compared to a Moscow winter? We'll come back to that launch. But this story doesn't start on a launch pad in Kazakhstan. It starts 3 years earlier, on a frozen sidewalk in Moscow, where a mixed breed stray, part husky, part terrier, 11 pounds, soaking wet, was living the only life she'd ever known.
Picture Moscow in 1954. Post-war reconstruction still visible in every other block. Buildings patched with mismatched brick. Steam rising from underground heating vents. And dogs, thousands of them, navigating the city's alleys and courtyards in loose, shifting packs. Not pets, not feral in the way that word implies violence. Urban survivors. They knew which restaurant kitchens left their doors cracked, which grandmothers left scraps on windowsills.
The Institute of Aviation Medicine had been collecting these dogs since 1951. A van would cruise the outer neighborhoods, not the center, where the dogs were too comfortable, the edges, where the strays were leaner, tougher, more adaptable. They wanted females because female dogs were smaller and the capsule space was measured in centimeters. They wanted calm temperaments, dogs that could sit still for hours without panicking. She was approximately 1 year old. She weighed about 5 kilograms. Captured sometime in the winter of '54, one of hundreds of strays pulled from Moscow's edges for testing. Most would fly suborbital missions and return. Some would wash out of the program. And one, just one, would be chosen for something nobody was meant to survive. The training program was methodical, and by the standards of the time, as humane as the scientists could manage. The dogs were placed in progressively smaller enclosures for progressively longer periods. Days at first, then weeks. The goal was to condition them to the capsule, a container so cramped that a dog could stand, sit, and lie down, but not turn around. They were fed a high-nutrition gel through a dispenser. Their waste was collected by a system built into the harness.
3 dogs made the final selection: Albina, Mushka, and Laika. Albina had already flown 2 suborbital missions and returned safely. She was the backup, too valuable to risk. Mushka was used for equipment testing. Laika was chosen for the orbital flight. The flight that everyone involved knew from the very first planning meeting would have no return.
Good luck, little friend. Engaging acceleration.
There was no re-entry technology. The capsule wasn't designed to come back. Sputnik 2 was a one-way ticket, and every scientist on the program understood that the dog they were training, the dog they were feeding by hand and naming and growing attached to, was being prepared to die alone, 2,000 kilometers above the Earth, in a metal box the size of a suitcase. Oleg Gazenko was 39 years old in 1957, a physician by training, a space biologist by assignment, and the man directly responsible for Laika's preparation for flight. He'd spent 3 years with her, 3 years of daily interactions, feeding, monitoring, adjusting her harness, running centrifuge tests that simulated the gravitational forces of launch. 3 years of a relationship that was supposed to be clinical and had become anything but.
She would greet me each morning by pressing her nose against my palm. Not excited, not desperate, just a quiet acknowledgement. I'm here. You're here. We begin. I found myself talking to her during the tests, narrating what was happening as though she could understand the science. Maybe she couldn't, but she understood my voice, and that was enough to keep her calm when the centrifuge spun.
The pressure from Moscow was enormous. Sputnik 1 had launched on October 4th, 1957, and the world had lost its collective mind. A Soviet satellite was orbiting overhead, beeping, and America was scrambling to respond. Khrushchev wanted a follow-up, something bigger, something that would prove Soviet superiority wasn't a one-time trick. He wanted it ready by November 7th, the 40th anniversary of the Bolshevik Revolution. That gave the engineers exactly 4 weeks. 4 weeks to design, build, and launch a spacecraft carrying a living passenger. In any rational timeline, this was impossible. Spacecraft take months. Safety systems take years. But this wasn't about safety or science or the well-being of a dog. This was about politics, about showing the world the Soviet Union could put life into orbit before anyone else. The dog was a symbol, and symbols don't need return tickets. The capsule was crude by any measure. Enough room for Laika to shift her weight, but not turn around. A fan for cooling that the engineers privately doubted would last more than a few orbits. An oxygen supply calculated for 10 days, not because anyone expected her to live that long, but because the Soviets planned to announce she'd been euthanized painlessly through poisoned food after a week. A gentler story for the press. He asked about it later. I wanted to do something nice for her. She had so little time left. He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. A scientist who'd spent his career measuring stress responses and oxygen consumption rates took a dog home to play because the numbers he tracked every day had added up to a conclusion he couldn't rationalize away. She was going to die, and he wanted her last evening on Earth to include a warm floor and children's laughter.
The next morning I placed her in the capsule myself, adjusted her harness, checked the sensors on her chest one final time. Then I did something that broke protocol in a way that could have ended my career. I leaned into the capsule and kissed her on the nose. The technicians around me pretended not to see.
Laika was sealed inside the capsule 3 days before launch. Standard procedure. The dog needed to acclimate to the confined space and the feeding system. 3 days. Alone in a metal container on top of a rocket in the freezing Kazakh steppe. The technicians monitored her vitals through external sensors. Heart rate, normal. Respiration, normal. She was calm, calmer than most of the humans around her. And then, it was November 3rd, 5:32 in the morning. The engines ignited, the gantry fell away, and Laika, the street dog from Moscow who'd never asked for any of this, was pushed back into her harness by a force 7 times her own body weight as the rocket climbed through the atmosphere and into the black. During the ascent, Laika's heart rate tripled, 240 beats per minute. Her breathing went rapid and shallow, the kind of respiration that indicates extreme stress in any mammal. The G-forces pinned her against the back of her harness with a weight that made her 11 pounds feel like 77. She couldn't move. She could barely breathe. And the noise, engines burning at full thrust, was a vibration she felt in her bone. Then the engines cut. The force dropped to 0. And Laika experienced something no dog had ever experienced: weightlessness. Her body lifted against the harness straps, her ears floated, the gel food in her dispenser drifted in its container. For a few minutes, she existed in a state that had no evolutionary reference point. No gravity, no ground, no up or down. Her telemetry data transmitted back to Moscow told a story in numbers. After reaching orbit, Laika's heart rate began to slow, from 240 down to 150, then 102, still elevated but approaching something like calm. She ate from the dispenser. She shifted in her harness. The sensors indicated she was alive, conscious, and adapting. The first living proof that a biological organism could survive the transition to orbit.
Think about what that means. A stray dog from Moscow was orbiting the Earth at 29,000 kilometers per hour, 100 kilometers above the ground, and she was eating. She was breathing. She was alive in a place where life had never existed before. Whatever came next, and what came next was terrible, that fact stands. Laika proved it was possible. Every human who's gone to space since owes a debt to an 11-pound dog who had no choice in any of it.
But the capsule's thermal control system was failing. The engineers had known it was marginal. 4 weeks wasn't enough time to build reliable life support. The insulation wasn't adequate, and with each orbit, the interior temperature climbed. 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 90, past 100. Laika died approximately 5 to 7 hours after launch. The exact time is uncertain because the telemetry became intermittent as the thermal systems degraded. The cause of death was hypothermia, overheating, combined with the stress of a situation no living creature was designed to endure. She was alone, 2,000 kilometers from the nearest living thing, in a metal box that was getting hotter with every orbit. And whatever she felt in those final hours, fear, confusion, the absence of the hands that had fed her, and the voices that had spoken to her every day for 3 years, none of it was recorded. The sensors measured heart rate and breathing. They didn't measure what it cost to die without understanding why.
The Soviet government told the world a different story. They said Laika had lived for several days. They said she'd been euthanized painlessly through her food supply. They said the mission was a complete success. None of it was true. But the truth that a dog had died of heat and terror within hours didn't fit the narrative. And in 1957, the narrative was all that mattered.
Sputnik 2 continued to orbit the Earth for 5 months after Laika died. An empty capsule carrying a body that had once been a quiet, calm street dog who pressed her nose into a scientist's palm every morning. It re-entered the atmosphere on April 14th, 1958, and burned up over the Caribbean. No recovery, no burial, no grave. For 45 years, the official Soviet record maintained the lie. Laika had survived for days. The mission was a triumph. And then, in 2002, at a conference in Houston, Texas, a 71-year-old Russian scientist named Oleg Kazenko stood at a podium and said the words that collapsed 4 decades of state propaganda in a single sentence.
Work with animals is the source of suffering to all of us. We treat them like babies who cannot speak. The more time passes, the more I'm sorry about it. We shouldn't have done it. We did not learn enough from the mission to justify the death of the dog.
He was crying when he said it. A man who'd spent his career in Soviet military science, where showing emotion was a career-ending vulnerability, stood in front of an international audience and cried for a dog he'd put into a rocket 45 years earlier. The room was silent. Not the polite silence of a conference audience, the heavy silence of people witnessing a confession. Kazenko carried that guilt like a stone in his pocket for the rest of his life. He died in 2007, 5 years after the confession, at the age of 89. Friends said he talked about Laika often in his final years. Not the science, not the data, the dog. The way she'd lean into his hand during feeding. The calm in her eyes during centrifuge tests. The last moment in the capsule when he'd kissed her nose and known, with absolute unforgivable certainty, that he was saying goodbye. In 2008, Russia erected a monument to Laika near the military research facility where she'd been trained. A bronze statue of a small dog standing on top of a rocket, ears forward, looking upward at a sky she'd been the first to cross. The plaque doesn't apologize, it doesn't explain, it simply states her name and what she did, and lets the weight of the story do the rest. And that's the fracture at the center of Laika's story. She's celebrated for her role in the space race, for proving that organisms could survive in orbit, for being the biological bridge between an empty cosmos and the human beings who followed her. But celebration requires consent, and Laika had none. She didn't volunteer, she didn't understand. She was a stray dog who trusted the people who fed her, and those people put her in a box and launched her into a place she couldn't come back from.
Every major space agency in the world now has ethical guidelines for animal research. Guidelines that didn't exist in 1957. The European Space Agency's charter cites Laika's mission specifically as a turning point. The principle is simple. You don't use a life you can't save. You don't launch what you can't bring home. It took a dead dog in orbit to make that obvious.
Yazdovsky, the man who took her home to play with his children, wrote about that evening for the rest of his life. He described the way Laika had chased a ball across his living room floor, the way his daughter had laughed, the way the dog had eventually settled beside the radiator and fallen asleep with her chin on her paws.
I remember this.
A normal evening, a warm floor, the last gentle thing she'd know. Laika was born on the streets of Moscow. She had no pedigree, no owner, no name until the Institute gave her one. She lived for approximately 3 years. She orbited the Earth for 5 to 7 hours. She died alone, overheated and afraid, in a capsule that was never meant to come back. And she changed the trajectory of human civilization. The debt isn't paid by monuments. It isn't paid by naming craters or printing stamps. The debt is paid by remembering her correctly, not as a hero, because heroes choose their sacrifice, not as a victim, because that word flattens her into something passive. Remember her as what she was, a living creature who trusted, who was used, and who opened a door that humanity walked through without looking back.
Monuments exist in at least 8 countries now.
Her name meant Barker, but the scientists said she rarely made a sound. A quiet dog in a quiet capsule, circling a planet that was already forgetting to listen.
Remember her